Hi, my name is Henzelene Heaelley, and I'm the founder and partner of VA Consultants. And today I'm here with Yat Siu. What a pleasure it is to be here with you, Yat Siu.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So the first thing that you said that was really thought-provoking for me was with regards to the digital identity. Because when people think virtual assets, it's usually they think anonymity. So when they think about having direct, identification,
Yes.
they're like, oh, it defeats the whole purpose. So can you just go into a bit
Sure.
more detail? Because what you said was really meaningful in
Yes.
nipping that in the bud, right?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is what is Web3, and
Yes.
we think of Web3 essentially as a web of ownership. And what does ownership mean? It means things that you can own. And what's the most important thing you can own? Your reputation. So I think as often people sort of take that aspect of sort of their selves, owning themselves, actually, as let's call it philosophical as it sounds, not serious enough, right? So they think of ownership as it's a house, or it's money, or it's assets. But actually, the most important thing is owning yourself and owning your good name, as it were. In history, for instance, it wasn't that long ago where most people didn't even own themselves, right? I mean, if you look at the history of people's last names, they actually tended to be things like based on the city they were or the profession they took, because actually we were all really serfs and slaves to some lord who basically was actually ruling over us, right? That was only hundreds of years ago. And so when you think about the currency that happens with reputation, for instance, ask the question, why do our parents, or maybe why do you want to go to college? Do you go to college? Why? Yeah, you want to get a better job. But really, what are you doing when you go to college? You're actually building a reputation for yourself. I went to this college. I studied this degree. And then when you think about the next step in terms of your job, maybe after your first job, what they look for references based on your other job, right? So it's not based on, they don't ask for your bank account. They don't ask how many assets you have. They ask, have you been a good person? Have you been a good employer or employee? Or what have you done, for instance, in life? And then, of course, the other thing is that the attestation that happens from the rest of the network is your friends' network, right? Just think about how you build your relationships. It's like, oh, I met this person. He wants to do business with me. What do you think of him, right? And what do? You basically try to build and ascertain whether his reputation is good or bad. Now, Web3 is actually perfect with that, because with zero knowledge proof, you can actually attest to someone's reputation without actually having to give away their identity. Right? I mean, imagine, for instance, if I go for a job opportunity, I don't have to show everything. I can only show what's relevant, right? And as a result, I can still be comfortable as the potential employer to say, you know what, actually, I've seen everything I need to know, and I don't even necessarily have to know, in some cases, whether, it's a guy or a girl, for instance, or maybe even how old this person is. I just need to know things that I need to know, right? So that's actually the power of zero knowledge proof. Now, this is kind of where Web3 becomes really interesting. I think we've gone a little too far on the whole sort of pseudonymous anonymity aspect. I mean, don't get me wrong, right to privacy, super important. But if we are in a society where nobody knows each other and nobody therefore can trust each other, then actually you don't have society, right? I talked earlier about how essentially tokens represent network effects. And actually, what is a country? How does the GDP of a country form? It's trust. If you don't trust the sort of the government, or if you don't trust your environment, then actually you can't build a foundation at all. And what is trust? That sort of bond of trust is essentially built on reputation, right? In other words, I know you're not going to steal from me, or I know you're not going to kill me. It sounds pretty basic, but again, 1,000 years ago, you might go to a strange environment and you actually had to worry about these basic things, which the reason why we can have commerce and all these things today is because we know that at a base level we can trust each other. So we need that in Web3. If I'm dealing with a new wallet every single time, I'll give you our own story. When we do an NFT mint, right, because people can make money this potentially, you have a lot of people that are trying to sort of basically take advantage of it. What do? They sign up, they do KYC and AML, which is of course normal, and then afterwards we find that the wallet is sold to like some bots or some other people who are actually, not really the end user we want to go after. And how do we solve that? Well, actually, the way to solve that is to say, look, if you are a user and you've built a certain reputation, you need to actually advance and develop that over time so that you can get more, just as we do in the real world. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with Mocha ID. And I think every other type of sort of ID system is looking to solve that particular problem, because when you have more trust, again, not only does it open sort of bigger markets like unsecured credit, it actually also creates more trust in your ecosystem. What is the biggest criticism people have about Web3? Oh, I'm not sure, I can't trust it, he's anonymous, right? And again, we want to be able to say, I don't need to know who you are, but I trust you, because you know what? You've been doing business for 3 years, and you have 1,000 people that say you're a good guy, and other people that I trust, that they trust, are attesting to the same thing. In Web 2, we have a very rudimentary system. it's called ratings. You know, the buyers and seller ratings, or when you go and do an Uber,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Those are ratings, right?
Agreed.
And I don't really need to know the name of the person, but again,
Exactly.
ratings are rudimentary.
Yeah.
Right? They're very basic, and I understand why we want to start with the basic level. But actually, people were much more complex, right? I mean, it wouldn't do us justice if we walked around and says, here, 9.5 rating, or here, 9.3 rating. I mean, yes, that's kind of what we are right now in
Yep.
Web 2, but we're much deeper than that.
Agreed.
And so in Web 3, building reputation, like what we're trying to do with Mochaverse, we think we can really create this trust infrastructure that's cross-chain as well, that everyone can then basically build on top of, right? And that's actually, us as a big investor in the space, we realized that that was a big problem in the space. Like, you know, we could potentially get defrauded, or how do we bring more people in safely in the space? And that's why I think, you know, what reputation is really important. Just to be clear, your anonymity is preserved.
Agreed.
Right? So you're not actually sort of giving away who you are. I think we're taking this translation of sort of, in order for me to know who you are, I need to know everything. That's not true at all.
Yeah.
Right? I think with zero knowledge proof, we can actually solve both the anonymity and the trust and reputation issue.
Agreed. And I think that's a great way of looking at it, right? Because if we're saying, okay, there's a concern with using virtual assets because we cannot identify, okay, then let's focus on what's important without giving away that. I completely agree with you.
Yes.
And I think that's very, very, very valuable in terms
Well, I mean,
of...
give you an example, for instance, one of the reasons why a lot of people are critical about airdrops, for instance, is because actually a lot of the airdrops go to bots.
Yeah.
They don't go to the actual users,
Yeah.
right? But if you can get the airdrop to the marketing dollars, as it were, to the
Agreed.
actual end users who are building value,
Yes.
then you've built a real network. Because
Agreed.
again, bots aren't a real network.
Yes.
Humans are.
Exactly.
And I think, you know, this idea of, you know, one of the reasons why we, for instance, also invested in Humanity Protocol is we have to first determine that you're a real human. Okay, so that's one thing. But then even after we know you're a real human,
Humanity.
do we know that you're a good human,
Yes.
right? Or do we know that you're serious about it, right? And so all these things matter. What you'll also find interesting, you just look at the real life, is that once you have a reputation, you will work to defend it.
Thank
right?
you.
Yes.
So true.
Right. Your reputation
Yes.
is your absolute currency, right? And in Web3, there are no consequences for having a bad reputation. Again, this is not, and we don't think it's the sort of the stick approach works very well. We think the carrot is much better. If you have a good reputation, more good things will come to you, as opposed to, okay, you've done a bad thing, we'll go after you. I mean, there is the enforcement area, of course, it's there, but that's never the best incentive. The best incentive is to say, as we have in society, if I have a good reputation, good things come to me. We need the same thing in Web3.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what people forget at the end of the day is, like, you know, okay, yes, things were once a certain way and we have to move with the times, but I think what people forget is that not all of them, but a lot of these instruments are still financial instruments, right? They still do need some level of...
Well, they're financial in nature.
Yes.
And that's and the reason why they're financial in nature is because Web3 combines them all
Yes.
on the same layer, which is something that wasn't done before. And that's why the consequences were low. Like, for instance, if you build a product and you would use it, really, you would lose your time and effort on it if it was shut down. But there was no financial implications per se. You know, and that's actually something that obviously is much more deeper in Web3, which is why trust is even more relevant.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean, like, I know that you guys are big into, so you started with the mobile games and then you moved into the Web3 games. I mean, like, your reputation absolutely precedes you, right? And then the NFTs came in, and now I know you guys are doing a bunch of other things. But for people that say that the NFT market is dead, essentially, because it's not as hyped up as it was
It's a $10
before.
billion market.
Exactly.
It's still $10 billion, so yes.
I want you, exactly. So
Yes.
I want to resell
Yes.
it to people, right? Like, I
so
understand it's still a big market, but tell us about the...
Yeah. Okay, so let me first sort of elaborate a little bit about...
Let's
sort of,
promote NFTs.
Yeah, but you know, yeah. I mean, I think what are NFTs?
Yeah.
NFTs are, for us, digital stores of culture.
Agreed.
Right? So digital stores of culture means that they are representative of something that I think is much more valuable than money. They're part of your identity. In fact, when we started thinking about Mochaverse and Mocha ID, it was inspired by identity because people were holding their NFTs and putting up the PFPs and creating a profile picture and being part of the community. It formed part of the identity of who they are. Now, think about the physical aspect of your cultural items. For instance, if I was wanting to own, for instance, certain assets, it could be something luxurious, like a Rolex, or it could be even something less expensive, like Nike shoes, or maybe a GoPro camera. Actually, what you're really doing is you're speaking something about your identity, right? You're actually saying, hey, actually, I own this item, therefore maybe I'm more let's say, sporty, or maybe I'm more like, for instance, why do people sort of buy, electric cars, right? In terms of cost per saving, not necessarily always better, but actually, again, you're trying to signify that you're part of a community. It forms a part of your identity. And NFTs do that for the digital context. Now, the reason why I think people are sort of looking at NFTs and saying, oh, it's gone to zero or whatever, which is not true at all.
No, it isn't.
Right? Is because it sort of is competing with meme coins on the narratives of the economic layer. So in my presentation, I essentially sort of illustrated that there's different levels of capital that people are looking for. There's economic, there's symbolic, there's cultural, there's social capital. These are all forms of capital, right? This is sort of made most famous by sort of, Bourdieu's idea of different forms of capital. And I think a lot of sort of economists look at that. So, the ultimate form of cultural capital would be, for instance, like, I don't know, something from Gucci or Hermes or LVMH, for instance. Now, if you were to look at the state of the market, and this is what NFTs occupied in 21, a lot of people bought NFTs not because of the cultural side.
Yeah.
They bought it because, I could get part of this mint and I could sell it for a lot of money. So in that sense, NFTs are competing with meme coins in the same narrative.
Yep.
But they also share the same thing around culture, maybe less symbolic, but certainly social capital. So when I have a meme coin, I'm part of a community. And, it could be fun, it could be silly, it could be ridiculous. And for those who are a little older, do you remember what it was like with the chat groups in the late 90s? Or, for instance, Reddit subgroups?
Yeah.
Or like they were all actually really trying to gain our attention, creating communities. That's actually what meme coins are. Of course, they have this financial nature, but that's actually what meme coins represent. They represent essentially social capital, but primarily the economic side. Now, what we believe is that we're currently at a stage where, and I talked about this because of the problems we have in capitalism, that the economic and social capital side is where most of the area is being dominated. And if you recall, in 21 and 22, NFTs essentially occupied that, right? And when people were looking at things like the, let's say, base layer chains, like the L1, L2s, they were very much looking at utility. So they didn't have the same cultural connection in the way that meme coins are basically sort of doing it today. But what we also believe is that as time goes on, when the market basically matures, just as we see in the physical physical world, that actually NFTs will essentially become much, much bigger because NFTs actually have much deeper cultural connections than a meme coin, right? And so the example I sometimes put is, let's say you have, a million of some meme coin. That's great. What's the difference between having 1 million and 2 million? What's the difference between 2 million and 5 million? What's the difference between 10 million and 20 million? There's a point where the sort of status and the connection is no longer as deep. And that's actually one of the reasons why, for instance, luxury goods in the physical world or status items actually are much, much bigger. I mean, the wealthiest family in the world is, certainly in Europe, is the Arnault family. What do they sell? They're not selling, utility goods. They're selling actually the human utility of status.
Agreed.
Right? And I think that's basically what NFTs represent. And so the other way I like to look at it is that in the physical world, what do we spend most of our money on? What is the biggest sink? What is the biggest TVL we spend on? It's culture.
Yeah.
It's not. It
is.
We make money to spend on culture. Whether this is whether this is food. I mean,
So
even
true.
food. You go for a nice meal. Right? It could be Michelin star, it could not. Actually, it's a cultural, social experience. You bring your friend in. It's much more fun to eat with your friends than it is to eat alone, for instance, right? And it's much more fun to sort of partake in something that's creative in the food rather than, basically just having, something that's very, very nutritious, but you basically can have in 5 seconds, right?
Agreed.
So again, we spend so much more money on all of the cultural items. Just count what you spend on your clothes, where you live, what you desire, and you might notice that maybe 90% is actually invested in cultural assets.
Yeah.
But we're not at that point yet. I think of the Web3 economy very similar to essentially the economies 30, 40 years ago. So much of it was economic in nature. But then notice what happens for those who have reached a certain type of economic capital. They're the ones who are buying CryptoPunks. They're the ones in Bored Apes. It's representative of the sort of cultural zeitgeist of that time, and that's actually what NFTs represents. Which is why we're long and bullish on NFTs for the mid to long term.
Of course.
But of course, we're in the cycle of things. Meme coins are, I think, bringing more people in from the economic side.
Yes.
But then if they want to stand out, they're going to have NFTs. And again, it's a $10 billion industry.
It is, and
Yes.
I think what people don't realize is that NFTs can have a lot more use cases.
Of course.
It's not just art. It's not just they can be held.
Yes.
They can hold data. They can hold music. They
I
can
give you-
transferable
yeah,
files.
I mean, this
NFT wrapper for property.
Absolutely. So this is a great example that you just sort of made me think about. For instance, in education with Open
Yes.
Campus, we actually used NFTs to essentially create intellectual property wrappers
See?
for teaching content. And what's really
you.
powerful is that people who are only making maybe $10 or $20 a month were now able to create an IP asset that might also only make $10 a year. However, as a capital asset, it was now worth $50 to $100. And that actually opens up the entire intellectual property frameworks. Imagine what the music industry would have looked like if there was no IP protection for music. There would be no Michael Jackson, no Taylor Swift, no BTS, whatever favorite musician you have. And there would be very, very poor music.
Agreed.
Because we wouldn't be able to invest in it because there was no industry, no Hollywood, none of that type of stuff, right? And again, it came from intellectual property protection.
100%.
But the problem is that the intellectual property protection frameworks right now require you to be of certain size. Like if I have to use a lawyer and I have to basically do all the trademarking and the copywriting, all that stuff costs a lot of money.
Thank you.
And as a result, I need to spend probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, which means the asset must make at least that much in order to make it worthwhile.
Exactly.
However, in Web3, with an NFT, you can do almost all of that for less than $1. So it opens up all of these new type of intellectual property capital assets that didn't exist before. And of course, you get extended to things like physical real estate as well, RWAs, of course, as well.
Exactly. With the NFT wrappers, and yes, and not just the music industry, but a lot of our clients are tech, right? So tech, like your data and your IP are your most important things. So I don't think people realize that there's way more use cases. But it was interesting what you were saying about the cultural, what did you call it? The cultural value, right?
Yeah, and we think of NFTs as digital stores of culture.
Right. So because Bored Apes did that, they did an experiment at some point or another, or somebody did an experiment where they took the original, like the most famous or popular Bored Ape NFTs, and they mirrored them, and they wanted to see whether the mirrored versions would get the same amount of value.
So there was actually a ripoff from someone who did that, but yes, I know the story, exactly.
Okay.
And
it didn't gain as much value, and so they were saying that there's a sentimental element that goes into the value of these NFT art pieces.
But it's not just so maybe
the cultural
the cultural side, but actually, what do we really seek for? Authenticity.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So authenticity is the main thing that we seek for. For instance, sometimes I remember in the early days when people were critical of NFTs, they're like, well, I could just, copy paste, right? And I just don't download a JPEG. I mean, you could say that about the Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
You go to Mona Lisa, take a photo. That doesn't make the Mona Lisa valueless. In fact, what it actually does, it makes the Mona Lisa more valuable, because millions and millions of people will now have taken photos of the Mona Lisa. That means the authentic original actually becomes more valuable as a result.
Agreed.
Which is the reason why, for instance, in the Bored Ape example that you gave, the original always has more value because it's the authentic piece, right? And actually, that's the one that it's not always true, but generally speaking, you're seeking for the authentic asset in question
100%.
because you want that true story. And what's beautiful about Web3 is that you can't forge it. So if someone was to make an exact copy of your Bored Ape, you'd always know instantly because of the hash that this is real and this is not. And I think this is something, again, that people may not fully appreciate, that actually this is how we deal with a lot of the forgeries that are out there, and also much of the cultural appropriation that happens when people, they take a photo. For instance, if you're on Instagram and someone basically takes a photo or shares a photo but makes it his own. I mean, you have all these stories where people pretend to do something that's not theirs. One of our portfolio companies called Dance Fight, what they did was, the reason why that company sort of launched and the inspiration was one of the dancers had his dance moves ripped off and actually used in Fortnite as an emoji. And then he complained and said, hey, this is my favorite game. It's cool that you use my moves, but hey, it's my moves. And he got nothing back because everyone's like, prove it, or maybe not even, right? So again, if he had minted it as an NFT, which is basically the inspiration of Dance Fight, then he can prove that he actually created that move and he actually has a case, and the community can also defend that, right? So there's many examples where NFTs, it's a form of culture, but now the authenticity is important. I know one of the big complaints I have about AI, for instance, like OpenAI, is that they take all this information from the world, but they don't cite your sources. So it's not about money. It's about we go to school and they tell us, you got to cite your sources when you get inspiration from what you're doing, right? But with OpenAI, they make it their own, and they basically just obfuscate everything else, which is not right as well. And again, if you put that on chain, and if your information, your picture, your images are on chain as an NFT, for instance, then they can reference that. And if you so desired, maybe even sort of scale royalty payments across basically
Agreed.
a large scale of users.
And this is my thing, people are so quick to point fingers. I mean, look, I think you'll agree with me, once you enter down the Web3 rabbit hole, you're in it. Like,
Yes.
you know what I mean? Like, you get
Absolutely.
so like engulfed in it, and
Yes.
like, but I think so people are so quick to point fingers without fully understanding, right? Because they obviously haven't come down the rabbit hole yet, but they don't realize that the things that they're saying that they're pointing fingers about, that's happening in the traditional financial industry.
It is, but it's not
happening in the
It's not exposed.
Exactly.
So, for instance, one of the, in our industry, often when people are critical about Web3 gaming, they say they don't want to financify it. What they don't recognize is that this $250 to $300 billion industry is essentially heavily financified. You just don't see it, and you still can't access it.
Exactly.
Nobody's saying that you must partake, but at least you have the option to, and you get that transparency. I think this is the part of the reason, when I was also giving my talk, is that in most of the world, we live in a capitalist society, but actually most people aren't capitalist. Right? They're kind of still stuck in the labor economy. They don't understand the value of money. They don't understand what money really is. And so it's kind of scary, right? And so what happens is that when suddenly money is involved, they see the problems that money have in the physical world, and they don't actually see how that can provide them opportunity necessarily, and they immediately reject it. That problem, by the way, is more deeper in the West, in particular, I think, in the US. And I think you see this with sort of how the politics are being broken down at the moment. In Asia, we don't have this problem. Like, for instance, even here in UAE, I don't see any problems with people saying, we have issues with money. Right? That doesn't happen here, and it doesn't happen in Asia. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that capitalism, in our memory, has been a very positive experience, whereas I think capitalism in America has been on the decline for the last 20, 30 years, right? I mean, they're making less money than their parents, for instance, right? When you think about, money inflation and all these type of things have actually hurt much of the Western world. It's actually threatened essentially, the faith in capitalism, the belief in that, and therefore also threatening somewhat the underpinnings of their democracies.
So I have a very interesting question to ask you, which is not necessarily Web3 related, but it is related to what we're talking about.
Yes.
A friend asked me recently, if you lost everything and you only had $1,000 in your bank account, what would you do? So,
Yes.
Yat Siu, same question to you. If you lost everything and you only had $1,000,
I would do something in
what
Web3.
now?
I would do something in Web3. I mean, outside of, I'm of course, we have to make some assumptions around sort of basic living and all that kind of stuff. But, I didn't come from wealth, right? I remember when I moved to Hong Kong, I don't know, this was like a long time ago, and I'm really dating myself, but just basically in the early 90s, right? And, my lunch cost and my dinner cost, actually basically my daily meal cost, of course, things were lower back then, was around 30 Hong Kong, which is, what is that? Maybe $3-4 US. That was my daily cost, living cost. And again, it wasn't destitute per se, but it wasn't expensive, right? So meaning that if you need to, you can actually manage with, managing your budget. There's ways to do that. And then what I would do is I would basically, build something in what I think where the future is going. And the reason why I say Web3, not just sort of to toot our own horn, is that I think that's where the future is going.
Agreed.
And therefore, if you, and when you look at sort of the histories of my friends that have seen success, or even our own journey, betting on where you think the future will go is usually a pretty good outcome, right? And the other thing I would also say is, one of my, let's call it sort of, I wouldn't say it's a secret, but sort of inspirations I get from is look at what your children are doing, right? Because if your children are doing it, that's an indication of where the future might be going, because your children are your future. So, whether it's video gaming, digital assets, or sort of our connections around them, they may not be exactly in that same form. But, if you look at what our children like to do, then you can actually learn more and more about where the future is going. And so to me, that's Web3, because our children may not fully understand what is a property right, but they do know that they want to own their digital time. And they do know that they want to generate value from that. They also appreciate their virtual reputation much more than the physical. Like, for instance, certainly my daughter is much more important, how many followers she has on Instagram than maybe what dress she wears, right?
It's 100%
and that was very different from my generation, where it was actually more important, maybe what you were wearing, and maybe that you were in a newspaper, as opposed to having followers on Instagram, right? So these narratives change, but that's just how generations, how the generational approach works.
No, that's very smart. Like, to look, I completely agree. Looking forward, right, to where it's going. But then it's very interesting that you said, like, look to what the kids are interested. I'd never thought about doing that before, but you're absolutely right, because that's the future generations.
Yes.
They're the ones that essentially propel where we're going.
Yes.
So fascinating. So another thing that you said during your talk, which which I think would be good for us to get to a mass audience. I could go through a whole list. But when it comes to why more people should get involved, right? There was some interesting points. So when you were talking about airdrops, you were saying you were comparing it to someone using a tech platform. For example, this is now the opposite.
The inverse of marketing. Yes.
So you were saying like, if you're a customer or whatever, you're not getting paid to shop at a place or use a platform or whatever.
Yes.
And if you're a shareholder, you don't necessarily get any other benefit. Like it doesn't build your reputation,
Yes.
right? But when you I think I'm flipping your first point now with the airdrop point, which came
related.
later.
It's related. It's related around the fact that you don't get the benefit of the network effects.
Yes.
Because, the example that I was giving, for instance, is that you could be a shareholder of Facebook.
Yeah.
Doesn't make you more influential on Instagram.
No.
And if you have 1 million followers on Instagram,
No.
it doesn't give you any benefit in, having anything in Facebook because they're totally unrelated to each other. But in Web3, through the token infrastructure, you can actually partake in these network effects. We think of network effects, however, as an entirely new asset class. So that's the other thing. So this doesn't remove anything around, owning a piece in a company or owning real estate. These are all relevant. So that construct of owning stuff is still there. But there's a new asset, the network effect, right? Which is something that we couldn't grasp before, right? So for instance, I would argue that the network of an Instagram is far greater than the value of Facebook in and of itself. And that's not because Facebook is not valuable. It's that Facebook is only able to extract a certain aspect of the value of the network that is Instagram. Right? So for instance, if you're building a business on Instagram, sure, Facebook gets a lot of the value, but you have a reputation that extends beyond Facebook, because maybe a newspaper will write about you, or you might get free benefits in a hotel, or like whatever that is, right? Yeah. That actually gives a value to the network that is not captured in the sort of, let's call it, equity value of a company. And that's actually what tokens represent. When you're buying a sort of, more established token, like an Ethereum token, for instance, actually you're not buying it because it gives you yield, right? Or that it gives you some kind of return. You're buying it because it gives you access and membership to a network that allows you to sort of grow and proliferate whatever you're trying to build, or because you believe this network is going to grow and you have a construct of doing that. In an economic sense, when people used to try to sort of buy into an economy, right, they would look at the growth of a GDP. They would look at indexing different companies to buy. That was kind of their way to say, I'm buying into the network of the USA or the network of UAE. And actually one of the best parallels for that was actually real estate. Right? So when you bought real estate in whatever country, you were actually buying essentially the proxy or the value of the network effect that was being built in that economy.
Exactly.
Right? Now, to me, though, tokens are much more egalitarian in the sense that, because you can fractionalize it down to whatever small value you want. Actually, it's like you could buy Bitcoin, you can't afford it, and buy Satoshis.
Yeah,
right? Like
absolutely.
Right? And, you can't buy a whole Ethereum. That's okay. You could buy a fraction of Ethereum. The point is, you can actually partake in the network at any level. Right? That's not possible in other assets. Right?
Exactly.
Whether it's expensive art pieces, violins, or for instance even real estate, right? It's not actually possible for you to directly own a piece of that. The biggest companies in the world have shareholdings of like 80 to 85,000 shareholders. Not bad, pretty decent. But isn't it strange that you have like hundreds of millions of people use Apple products, but you don't have hundreds of millions of shareholders of Apple? Or what about the billions of people that use Facebook? Yeah. How many of them actually own shares in Facebook? Like it just somehow doesn't connect. But it also doesn't work because you can't manage 1 million shareholders, but you can manage 1 million token holders.
Exactly.
So you can imagine a future, which is why I talked about essentially why I think DAOs and essentially sort of community-owned networks are going to be much bigger, because this is actually the framework in which you could literally have 1 billion people be part of the network and own a piece of that network, which is something you can't do in Web 2.
Exactly. No, I like there's so many points here, but on the other flip side of it as well, like how much liquidity is the market losing by not having fractional ownership of a lot of these things? Like, yes, okay, we have the stock market. Yes, okay, there are crowdfunding platforms, but imagine if we could tokenize all of these things. Remember what the world, if you have to go back in history, but hundreds of years ago when there was no stock market. Yes.
How much liquidity was trapped?
Thank you.
Exactly. Same thing. And now we're just opening up new assets and new areas through tokenization.
And it's helping people to gain like fractional ownership of things that they may not have been able to have before.
There is something...
And liquidity for the market.
Exactly. And I think this is really important.
And if we have a digital identity, we're golden.
Exactly. Absolutely.
See?
But I think the other thing is, we've been trying to teach financial literacy to people for a long time because we know that when you're in Web3, you become financial literate. One of the biggest challenges is that how do you get them interested in it, right? And so, I grew up in a family of musicians. My mom was a musician, and she was all about the art. Totally get it. She wasn't really interested in money. In fact, since I grew up in Austria, we couldn't even talk about money. Like money was kind of like kind of dirty word, that type of stuff. But more importantly, it wasn't interesting because so if you're interested in stocks or if you're interested in investing, then maybe you have an interest in learning about money or that kind of stuff. But if you're actually in a certain profession or a certain area, you actually don't want to, you don't have an interest in this. But actually with tokens, you can start to financify assets of interest. Right? So recently I tokenized a Stradivarius, which is
what, sorry?
A Stradivarius, which is basically an expensive
you have to explain
violin.
that to
right?
me. Okay.
So Stradivarius is an expensive violin,
Got you.
but it appreciates 15% a year.
Oh, wow.
Right, so it's
incredible.
there's only 600 in the world. You can check it up online.
Perfect
right?
to tokenize.
Anyway, however, most people around the world that haven't heard of Strat is like, I don't know, whatever, right? However, musicians are like, oh, I know what a Strat is. And using that as a mechanism to get people interested about money and finance and getting involved. Because a musician might say, I'd love to own a piece of a Strat because I have a connection with this. That's what NFTs taught us, that actually you were tied to a certain, let's call it asset, because there was an emotional connection. And through that emotional connection, you ended up learning something about money or assets or value that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think this is the whole point, which is that we struggle with teaching people financial literacy because we don't make it relevant. It's kind of like children, right? Like, some children love math and most children don't, but if you make it, if you contextualize it to them in the right framework, then actually they will learn the subjects better, right? So I think it's exactly the same thing. And now with tokenization, we can actually assetize anything and therefore make it relevant to whatever audience, even if they don't know anything about money, they will learn about it because actually it's relevant to them.
Exactly. No. So you spoke about tokenizing, and I'm sorry, the Stradivarius?
Yes.
Okay. But then we're talking about what NFTs taught us. So did you create like that? Like, did you essentially tokenize an NFT?
Yes.
Like,
so
okay.
we basically, as
Fine.
NFT was used as collateral.
Okay.
That was step
Just
one.
wanna,
right. But it awakened in the music industry,
Yes.
that part
Exactly.
of the music industry, and
That's
interest
the
in
important part. Yes, exactly.
What can you do? What does it mean?
Exactly.
Right? And that's what we need, right? We
Of
need
course.
more conversations that sort of inspire and sort of create a sort of thought around what's possible,
Exactly.
as opposed to just instantly dismissing it. Like, for instance, if you go to, let's call it someone who doesn't know much about the finance, and talk to him about something happens in Wall Street, he's like,
Exactly.
I don't care, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But okay, so having said that, right, because I completely agree with you, like, let's help more people become familiar with the space. So then on a closing note, right, because there was a bunch of things you said about, like, for example, airdrops people getting paid, and it brings them into the
That's
community,
correct.
right?
Yes.
We build a community, it's everything's connected.
Yes.
So as a closing note, like, these are very good, I think these are very valuable points to bring up to a wider audience and the internet to get more people into the space. So
I mean,
say whatever you want to say now.
Of course, yeah. So first, the important thing about Web3 is that you can now be a stakeholder in the network, which means that you can partake in its value, and you also rewarded for essentially building value to the network. All the people who use Instagram, only a very small percentage create any value, and they don't do it from Instagram itself. They do it externally, like promotions, that kind of stuff. But actually, collectively, every user on Instagram is valuable. In fact, you, the user, are the product, and you're making it better. Imagine what Instagram would be like if nobody was using it. It'd be worth zero. So then the question I ask is, why shouldn't you get paid for that or receive a share in whatever is being built? And that's actually something that I think people don't ask themselves because they don't necessarily understand or appreciate it. But we say that basically your digital time is valuable. Your effort online is worth something. You're just not getting fairly rewarded for it, if at all. And that's actually what Web3 does. And airdrops is just one mechanism of that, but there's many ways where you basically, once you become an owner of something, then value will come to you. But it's not just value, it's not just the sort of economic value, it's also things like reputation, identity, status, cultural, and symbolic.
Definitely. And if that is then, if that gives you either access to your place in a DAO, or if you are involved in a DAO, then you essentially have a say in how the community is operating, or the profits are distributed, or there's multiple.
Exactly. I mean, take an example, even in the Web2 context. Why shouldn't you be able to move your reputation that you've played in 5 games to another game? Why should it only be isolated? Every time you start a new game, you start like you're a new user. You've never started before. That doesn't make any sense to me, right? But actually, that's the other thing, that once you build reputation over time, having built different things or participating in this, actually what happens is opportunity will come to you.
Agreed.
Right? For instance, if you're really good at these games, chances are you might even get the game for free. Or you might get a super big discount because they know that you're going to add value to the game.
Yes. Agreed. So, Should we make that the closing note?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Okay. No problem. Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else before we end the podcast?
So I would say maybe just for my closing note, basically,
Yes.
normally what I would like to say is that, property rights has really transformed the physical world.
Yeah, it has.
And, most people might not even realize that, hundreds of years ago, we didn't own property. And the size of the GDPs, the innovation, everything grew because of that. In the digital world, we actually don't have any property rights right now, which means that the trillions of dollars of value that's generated today will, we think, 20, 30, 40x from where it is right now.
Of course.
Because essentially they become capital assets.
Yeah.
And that to me is really, every time you democratize access to anything, actually value increases because value is shared more fairly across. And we also believe that will ultimately also solve the wider problems we have around the centralization of capitalism today, which isn't really capitalism, right? It's become sort of usurped by sort of large oligarchs. But actually, when you have a much more distributed framework of capitalism, which is what tokenization can offer, then actually I think we'll go back to the true roots of what capitalism and a free and fair and open market was supposed to be.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I have to ask you another question after that.
Okay.
Because you just opened up like a different, just one more question.
Sure.
So when it comes to, because I agree with you, like tokenization of property is a big thing, especially real world assets is one thing, but actual property is another. No, there are concerns with that, but there's so much interest in the space for it, and I agree. I think it's needed. So, how would you suggest? What are some of the ways that could be taken in order to tokenize property?
First, I'm broadly less.
Sorry, Yat Siu,
no, that's
you
okay.
did this to yourself.
No, that's okay. I'm broadly less excited about physical real estate for tokenization.
Fine.
But let me explain why.
Okay.
I'm not saying it hasn't got potential. Absolutely, right. Just to be clear, you get more access. You could potentially, but it is a security, but you could get sort of fractional ownership on things. These are all really, really powerful, and there could be better membership around them. So but I see real estate tokenization as a incremental innovation to property ownership, not a disruptive innovation.
Got you.
Right, and so, for instance, I think disruptive innovation would be things of virtual assets like network assets or virtual game items because they have no value today, as in they have no fixed value because you can't really own them, right? So when you make that ownership property possible, you open up whole new markets that didn't exist before. Whereas with the physical real estate, I think there are two issues. First issue is who owns the physical real estate today? Essentially, people who already have a lot of money, right? Whereas Web3 is broadly a new wealth class for the time being. And the second one is around, there is already a framework for real estate sales. There's already a framework in which conveyancing and that kind of stuff happens. So yes, it could be much more efficient. So that's why I say it's incremental. Could real estate markets sort of, quadruple because of tokenization? I believe that. But I don't think it's going to go 100x in the way that essentially virtual goods that don't have any property rights framework have. So I'm much more interested in the things that aren't property rights that digital property rights can now enable, rather than things that could be RWA tokenized. Again, huge.
That makes sense.
But the narratives are important because that's how you get people in, right? It's like ETFs is a good example. Now institutions are saying, oh, you know what? I can have access to this asset, and now they open up. So yes, very important. But I don't think it's going to benefit the way that we could if we basically just sort of took assets that have the potential but couldn't be turned into property, can now do so because of tokenization.
Oh, okay, fine, I understand. Oh, I wish we could have had longer. I would have asked you about the Mochaverse and all kinds of things. But anyways, maybe we can arrange another one.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Yat Siu, it was such an honor. Thank you for taking the time to have this podcast with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
you.
Yeah.